What's up, wizards? Welcome back to Across the Horizon. So we're exploring the wisdom of the 100 aphorisms attributed to Ptolemy, and we are on aphorism number 6. So I'll go ahead and get us started with the Ashmont translation, and that is, it is advantageous to make a choice of days and hours at a time well constituted by the Nativity. Should the time be adverse, the choice will in no respect avail. However favorable in issue it may chance to promise.
Okay, so the Partridge says, an election of days or hours is then effectual when it agrees with the Nativity, for otherwise the election, though well made, will not profit.
Yeah, this is something
I don't agree. Nope.
No, I know. This is a thing that we discussed. If you go back to our discussion on John Gadbury and Electional Astrology, we talked about this, and this is basically saying, hey, electional astrology is useless without having a nativity. So I will go ahead and let you respond to this in full.
A couple things I would say about that. It's like, first of all, this is really attractive to modern astrologers or people that, contemporary practitioners of astrology, because basically most people started off astrology with natal. And in fact, the vast majority of people, if you say astrology, they think birth charts. That's it. And that astrology is nothing but birth charts. And so there's that comes into it, so that they're not familiar with anything else. So obviously it would make sense that you'd base it on the natal chart, because there's nothing but the natal chart. That's the be all and end all of astrology as far as they're concerned. The other thing about it is it's about me, right? And if it's anything to do with me, it's got to be me. That's the most important thing. The entire universe revolves around me, and it makes sense that everything that has to happen would basically have to revolve around my birth chart, because I'm the most important person. I'm the center of the universe. So there's a lot pulling people towards that. Now, I think what's interesting about it is, with the exception of Gadbury, right? If you look at a traditional source, they'll say, oh, you got to look at the natal chart, but then they never tell you how to do it. So that's one of the problems with it, is like, okay, that's interesting. What does this mean in practice? And so that's a real problem for everybody. So example, you've got Ramsey in his Astrology Restored, who says exactly the same thing. He says you got to look at the natal chart, and then again doesn't give any explanation of how to do that. So that's a real practical problem, is that, okay, you insist on saying this is totally important, and then on the other hand, you're like, well, how do we do it? Nothing. Now Gadbury, who discusses it, goes into great detail about the use of a natal chart as the basis for a election for a horary chart, and then also not using it at all. And so clearly not, and he says like, it's just okay not to have the natal chart, because not everyone's natal chart is available. He says it's not a complete waste of time to do it. What I would say about that is this, is that, again, if you think about it, what you're looking at with these different charts are different sort of slices of reality, different sort of focus on different cycles. Right? And so really there's not just your personal fate that's going on. You've got all sorts of different levels. So you got your personal fate. Election is that particular moment, right? At that particular location. So that's a different cycle. Your family fate, your country, the economy, the world. I mean, you've got mundane with these big cycles, the great conjunctions and things like that. So really the natal chart is just one cycle. And I don't think that you necessarily would privilege that over every other cycle. I mean, I used to joke that, if you had a really good natal chart in Poland in 1939, you get to be a refugee instead of being dead. It doesn't overthrow. And again, Lilly makes, and Benatti, I think, also makes the comment, says, if you have a prince and a beggar's son born at the same time, right, obviously you're going to have very different lives. And if there's a good transit or something, or good whatever natal timing that's going on for both of them, then the prince becomes, become very wealthy or has a great victory, and the beggar son becomes a big deal in his neighborhood. There's all sorts of different levels of perspective, and to privilege the natal chart as the be all and end all, and if it's not exactly in the natal chart, it's meaningless, I think is just, I don't buy that. I don't think that that scale is the most important of all and overthrows everything else. And so the problem I have from a practical standpoint is this, is that you can control about, say, 3 or 4 maybe 5 factors in an election, right? You can select those. And if you do a natal chart, what that means is you have to stick natal factors in. That cuts down on how many factors you can control in the election. So, and it's noticeable with Gadbury's Nauticum Astrologicum, the 2 examples he gives for the one for the natal chart and horary, they're not very good elections. And they can't be, because you have to shoehorn the factors, the horary or natal factors into it. So I said, you know what? I like to get a really nice election. I did one recently for somebody, a business election. It was great. It was an internet business, like selling soap and beauty products or something like that. So it was like Mercury ruling the 1st and the 10th. So the 1st is the business and the 10th is marketing and sale, reputation. And it was Mercury like Virgo, I think. And then the Venus was ruling the 2nd house in Libra. So Venus is appropriate for like, beauty and fashion and stuff, and it's really strong. So it's like, wow, you got a great business, great marketing, great money. The internet stuff, Mercury is appropriate for that. Venus is appropriate for fashion and beauty. The moon was, I think, in Taurus. So I'm like, wow, this is a great election. But if you look at the person's natal chart, they, oh, well, what are the chances that the moon, Mercury, and Venus weren't afflicted or something? Like, oh, well, Venus rules the 8th. Okay, that's fucked. So it just makes it almost impossible to find an election. And it's very armchair to be like, oh, you have to be based on the natal chart. Well, how do you do that? In practice, it's really not. So that's what I've in one sense, I don't think it's necessary. And 2, it's just not practical. So I think that that's one of the things that my iconoclastic, heresies is that I don't base it on the natal chart. Now, the people that do base it on the natal chart, I think what they do is they'll just like pick 1 or 2 factors. There's really not a methodology that I've seen that's, coherent for that. And another thing you'll do is like, okay, these 15 things are bad, but it's Mercury's Cazimi, so that means it's okay. I mean, that's the other classic thing to do, is to redeem your election, and or explain away the negative stuff. I take that very seriously, but then I don't, I throw this all out. So what I do is I have a few factors. I take them very seriously, but I don't look at anything other than those factors. And that's just the methodology that I use. So I'm not saying that everyone else is wrong. I'm just saying that I'm not wrong. Everybody else can do what they want. But the methodology I'm going to follow is going to continue to focus on just the election. So I would say I would have to disagree with, my check mark on this one will be I disagree with this particular aphorism.
Well, so the other thing going on with the aphorisms too, like, okay, as far as elections, if you're going to pay attention to electional times and try to make it line up with the birth chart, most of what influenced me early on with electional astrology was electional magic. And if you dig up through the electional magic examples, there are some that kind of play with that, but most of them are all about, okay, well, make this talisman at this time, paying attention to these things. And it takes really digging into any work to try to even find prescription in the way that even you do it, where it's like, hey, if you have debilitations in your natal, maybe you should avoid those talismans. But like, if you look at the Picatrix, it's straight up saying, hey, here's how you make this talisman, here's what it will do, and go off and do it, and not paying attention to any of that.
That's actually a good point, is that if you look at the yeah, that's really good, because it just says, look, go ahead and make it at the time when Venus is strong. Venus talisman, Venus should be strong, and that's what you focus on. I mean, you could try to do something else other than, I mean, like, but yeah, I think right there's a logic to that. And, the essence of both horary and electional is focus, right? Natal, every bit of the chart's important because it's all different parts of your life, right? But a horary or electional, you're only looking at certain pieces of the chart and we ignore the rest of it, and with election, what we try to do is the recognition is you can maximize, given your time range, given what you're working with, let's do the best we can over this range. But we know we're not going to be perfect, right? It's impossible. And, I think that there's a limit. At some point, it's a little bit arbitrary over what you want to put up with as far as negatives. But the idea that you can eliminate all negatives is just totally unrealistic. And, but yeah, I really do like that point about Picatrix, because I think it gets the root of it, which is like, come on, there's huge chunks of our sources saying make it this way, and they're not saying anything about natal, other than making sure, maybe you don't want to use it, or if it's afflicted in natal chart. But even Picatrix doesn't say that. What Picatrix says is a couple times it says, well, if you're making a Jupiter talisman or invoking Jupiter and Jupiter's strong in your chart, then that you'll be even better at it. You'll be even stronger. It doesn't even say you can't do it if it's weak, right? It just says it'll be stronger if it is stronger. So to me, that's more like you have a natural relationship with that planet, right? And you get along with it really well, so you're able to do it. But yeah, so what I would say about this is that I think that ultimately that you could go either way. You could go with the aphorism, right? Or you could go with us. And I think that the majority says, yeah, it's important, but then they don't explain how to do it. And so this is one where there's really a difference of opinion about it. And I think there's pretty much you could go, whatever, resonates with you, that's definitely the view to go with. I don't think there's a right or wrong. I'm not saying I'm right with this, but at the same time, I obviously don't think I'm wrong either.
Well, I will totally drag us out a little bit longer with this, because I do think that discussing the other side of that might be valuable too, which is if you do something and and this isn't even a thing, this is something I'm fascinated with, but I haven't been able to link it up either. But doing natal timing and figuring out the Time Lords, I see that there could be a lot of value of knowing when to use various elections based on the various levels of things. But I think that also involves some kind of weird celestial accounting, which may not actually work, but I think it's worth experimenting with.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think with this, there's a lot of there, and it's interesting because I think people are always looking for one right answer. And I like paradox. Maybe it's my sort of Mercury side but I like stuff that's confusing. And I think that there's lots of different approaches you could take here. And I wouldn't want to say, oh, if you find it important to totally ignore the natal all the time for everybody. It's just sort of like the weight is, oh, of course you have to pay attention to the natal. How could you not? And it's like, but that to me is mostly coming from people's natal orientation, either from modern astrology or because they're like, oh, it's about me, as opposed to really, taking a strong philosophical, because it could go, again, you could go either way if you look at the traditional sources.
Cool. Well, I guess we'll see you guys next week then when we cover the next, I guess, number 7.